Welcome to NibblePop Stories. Today we will hear the story of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. A very wealthy bachelor, Mr. Charles Bingley, moves to the English town of Meryton. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet live close by at Longbourn with their 5 unmarried daughters, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Catherine, and Lydia. The news about the arrival of an eligible bachelor sends Mrs. Bennet, a long-time resident, into a flurry of excitement as she plots to marry one of her 5 daughters to this affluent newcomer. Mrs. Bennet's eagerness is understandable. In early 19th century England, middle-class women like the Bennet sisters could not inherit money or property, making a good marriage their only chance at financial security. The opportunity to meet Mr. Bingley comes at a local ball. Bingley dances with Jane and suggests his friend Mr. Darcy should also dance. However, Darcy declines and insults many of the women present, including Elizabeth. She overhears Darcy saying, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me, and I am in no humour at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men." Despite Darcy's immense wealth, his haughty manner leads the townspeople to consider him overly proud. Meanwhile, Jane begins to show interest in Bingley, and she is encouraged by Elizabeth. Soon after this, Jane visits Mr. Bingley's estate, but she falls ill during her visit. Elizabeth goes to stay with her. There, Mr. Darcy starts to notice Elizabeth's wit and intelligence, much to the annoyance of Miss Caroline Bingley, who is Bingley's sister, who has her own designs on Darcy. On one occasion, Darcy confesses to Elizabeth about his quick temper and the fact that he cannot forgive easily. When Elizabeth remarks, "Your defect is a propensity to hate everybody," he replies her with a smile, "And yours is willfully to misunderstand them." Mrs. Bennet, during this episode, visiting Jane, embarrasses Elizabeth with her lack of social skills. So when eventually the girls return home, Darcy feels relieved. She attracted him more than he liked, and Miss Bingley was uncivil to her and more teasing than usual to himself. Soon, Bennet family receives an unexpected visitor, Mr. Collins, who is Mr. Bennet's cousin and the future heir to the Bennet estate. Mr. Collins, obsequious and self-important, intends to marry one of the Bennet daughters to keep the estate in the family. Meanwhile, Elizabeth befriends Mr. Wickham, a militia officer who shares a controversial history with Darcy, further souring Elizabeth's opinion of him. Soon, at another ball at Netherfield, Darcy asks Elizabeth to dance, leading to a tense conversation about Wickham. Elizabeth's family continues to embarrass her, making her question their social standing. Soon after this, Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth, but she rejects him. While her mother is furious, her father supports her decision. The Bennets' peace is disrupted again when Jane receives a letter from Caroline Bingley, revealing that the Bingleys have left Netherfield. She hints at a potential match between Mr. Bingley and Darcy's sister Georgiana. Heartbroken, Jane travels to London, hoping to see Bingley, but Caroline's cold reception and Bingley's absence lead Jane to suspect foul play. Elizabeth travels to London as well and visits her friend Charlotte Lucas, who is married to Mr. Collins. During her stay, Elizabeth dines at Lady Catherine de Bourgh's estate, where she learns more about Darcy's background. Following a lecture to Charlotte on managing her household, Lady Catherine, who is Mr. Collins's patroness, interrogates Elizabeth with intrusive questions about her family, property, her upbringing. She criticizes the Bennets for their decisions, such as educating their daughters themselves and neglecting their musical training. Lady Catherine is taken aback when Elizabeth responds boldly, sharing her own views in response to Lady Catherine's criticisms. Now, Lady Catherine has arranged a visit from her nephews, Darcy, who is her favorite, and Colonel Fitzwilliam, his cousin. Darcy meets Elizabeth with his usual reserve. Elizabeth and Colonel Fitzwilliam get along very well. The next morning, Elizabeth is surprised by a visit from Darcy. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam continue their visits, but Darcy remains unreadable. Charlotte begins to suspect that it might be Fitzwilliam who has feelings for Elizabeth. While walking near Rosings, Elizabeth frequently encounters Darcy, who inquires about Charlotte and the area, leading her to suspect he is trying to match her with Colonel Fitzwilliam. During a walk with Fitzwilliam, he mentions Darcy's intervention in a friend's improper match. This, Elizabeth realizes, is about Bingley and Jane, and she becomes very angry at Darcy now that she understands that Darcy is responsible for splitting up Jane and Bingley. However, Darcy surprises Elizabeth by proposing to her, admitting his love. But his tone is intimidating and proud. He says, "In vain have I struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you." He spoke with pride about his sense of her inferiority and how her family was a barrier. He expresses these thoughts with such intensity that, while it showed he understood the gravity of what he was saying, it did not help his case for winning her over. Elizabeth vehemently rejects him, citing his role in her sister's unhappiness and his mistreatment of Wickham. In response, Darcy writes a letter explaining his actions. He writes that he believed Jane did not love Bingley with the same intensity as Bingley did. He even admits that he could have made a mistake there. He further writes that Wickham had squandered away money that Darcy gave him and even attempted to elope with his sister for property. This revelation causes Elizabeth to think about her judgments. During a trip that Elizabeth takes with her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, she visits Pemberley, the estate of Mr. Darcy. They are met by the housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, who is more pleasant and less formal than Elizabeth expected. As they toured the elegant rooms and admired the beautiful landscape, Elizabeth reflects on how she might have been the mistress of such a place had she accepted Darcy's earlier proposal. In one room, Elizabeth notices a portrait of Mr. Wickham, which prompts a discussion with the housekeeper, who speaks of Wickham's troubled past. Mrs. Reynolds then shows them a picture of Mr. Darcy, praising him as the finest gentleman she has known, surprising Elizabeth with her high regard for him. Elizabeth begins to see Darcy in a new light, realizing that her previous judgments of him may have been mistaken. During their tour, Darcy unexpectedly arrives. Elizabeth is stunned and embarrassed, but Darcy is very polite to everyone. He impresses Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, Elizabeth's uncle and aunt, with his courtesy and invites Mr. Gardiner to fish in his streams. Elizabeth silently wonders if Darcy might still love her. The next day, Darcy shows up with his sister Georgiana and Bingley for a visit. Georgiana proves to be a shy girl and not proud at all. Bingley, delighted to see Elizabeth, asks questions that make her suspect that he still loves Jane. Darcy and Georgiana invite Elizabeth and the Gardiners to Pemberley for dinner the following evening. Elizabeth is amazed at the change in Darcy. The visit leaves her with much to ponder about Darcy's true character and his potential virtues. Soon, Elizabeth receives 2 distressing letters from Jane. The first shares the shocking news that Lydia has run off with Wickham to get married in Scotland. The second letter reveals even worse. Colonel Forster has discovered that Wickham has no intention of marrying Lydia. Elizabeth is clearly distraught. She goes out to seek help from her uncle and finds Darcy there. She confides in him. Longbourn is abuzz with the news that Wickham has accrued serious debts in Meryton and Brighton. Everyone was deceived by his charm and good looks. Mr. Bennet and Mr. Gardiner search London hotels but find nothing. Mr. Gardiner suggests Elizabeth seek help from anyone connected to Wickham, hinting at Darcy, but she is too embarrassed. Despite all efforts, Wickham and Lydia remain unfound. 2 days later, Mr. Gardiner sends a letter. Lydia and Wickham are found, though not yet married. Wickham demands an annual payment from Mr. Bennet for their marriage. The family believes they must marry to salvage Lydia's reputation. The family feels that perhaps Mr. Gardiner has already given Wickham a considerable amount of money. Lydia and Wickham return to Longbourn for a short visit. Lydia, while boasting about her wedding, accidentally reveals to Elizabeth that Darcy had attended the wedding. Lydia hastily apologizes for disclosing this secret. Elizabeth gets very curious. She writes to Mrs. Gardiner for further information. Mrs. Gardiner sends a long reply with details about how Darcy went to London, tracked down Wickham, stopped him from abandoning Lydia and escaping to Europe, and then negotiated a deal with Wickham and presented it to Mr. Gardiner. Darcy would pay and Mr. Gardiner would take all the credit. Elizabeth is filled with gratitude. Mr. Bingley returns to Netherfield with Darcy. After several visits, Bingley proposes to Jane, who joyfully accepts. It becomes clear that Caroline Bingley, Bingley's sister, had tried to keep them apart. Shortly after, Lady Catherine visits Elizabeth, demanding she promise not to marry Darcy, as he is supposedly engaged to her daughter. Elizabeth refuses to promise anything, asserting her own independence. Only days later, Darcy comes to Longbourn with Bingley. They all go for a walk, and Elizabeth and Darcy soon find themselves alone. Darcy returns to propose to Elizabeth once more, and this time she accepts, having grown to love him. Darcy regrets his first proposal to Elizabeth. He has been prideful since childhood and presumed that she would accept. He thanks Elizabeth for teaching him a lesson about humility. Elizabeth too apologizes for treating him so roughly. 1 year later, Jane and Bingley settle in an estate close to Elizabeth and Darcy at Pemberley. Mrs. Bennet, filled with pride, frequently visits them. Mr. Bennet, longing for Elizabeth, also visits often. Kitty, who is no other than Elizabeth's younger sister Catherine, improves by spending time with her elder sisters. Mary remains with her parents. Lydia continues to show her shallowness. She sends Elizabeth a congratulatory letter and asks if Darcy could contribute some money to them. Although annoyed, Elizabeth uses her own savings to send them the money. Lydia sometimes visits Pemberley, though always without Wickham, whose affection for her has definitely waned. Even Lady Catherine eventually accepts the marriage and occasionally visits. Elizabeth and Darcy remain on close terms with Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, grateful for the Gardiners' role in bringing them together. So this is how we get to the point when we can say, and they lived happily ever after. For more stories like this, subscribe to NibblePop. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off, and assuming you are still awake, good night and sweet dreams.